Hello everyone, I'm going to be talking today about our work with Ciamac and Tim on a generalization of Myerson's optimal auction theory. Let's start with a plot of land in the desert. You own this otherwise unassuming piece of real estate. Not only this, but you also own two other nearby plots of land with the same arid characteristics. One day, you sell one of these lands to someone, let's say the first one. And then, in a plot twist, you discover that this individual knew that underground of this land, 1,000,000 tons of black gold or oil were to be found. How should this affect how you sell the next items in what you thought was an uninteresting portfolio of land? That's what this talk is going to be about. We're going to go through three parts. First, I'm going to review the classical IPV setting, independent private values. Then we'll go on beyond IPV to a setting which captures applications like the one before better. And finally, I'm going to show you that in this non-IPV setting, you can get a result almost as clean as the one we're used to for the IPV setting. Now, we're going to focus on single item auctions, that is, for a single indivisible resource, like this painting here. But our framework covers general single parameter settings. Now, you'll tell me single item auctions, isn't this a solved problem? Well, the answer is yes, under certain assumptions about the structure of people's valuations. That is, in what's called the IPV model. What are these two assumptions that someone needs to make? Well, first of all, independence. That is, if we think of its buyer's valuation as a random variable, then they're all stochastically independent. And private, that is, that everybody is capable of knowing exactly what their value is, so that their value does not depend on information that they don't have. If you're wondering what's an application where that's not true, hold that thought, we'll get to it in a minute. And so in an auction that takes inputs from the bidders and outputs an allocation of the painting along with a price to pay for this allocation, the goal is to optimize some objective, let's say revenue, welfare, something else, given that the bidder's inputs are truthful. And we're going to have a condition that's going to be called incentive compatibility that is going to basically guarantee that the bidder's inputs will be truthful. And we're going to optimize over all of these mechanisms. So the traditional Myerson's setting basically concerns a seller that does not know the values themselves, but has in advance knowledge of the distributions that these values come from. So let's say that the cumulative density function is f capital of I, and the probability density function is little f of I. The goal in the setting is to maximize the expected seller revenue that the seller gets from this auction. And so Myerson characterized that a direct mechanism is going to be truthful, that is incentive compatible and individually rational, if and only if two conditions hold. First, the allocation rule has to be monotone, and secondly, the prices have to arise in a specific fashion from the allocation rule. Now, Marson gave a complete solution in this setting. What do I mean by complete solution? He characterized the optimal allocation, that is, with the maximal revenue, as the one picking the bidder with the highest positive virtual value that is a transformation of the bidder's inputs. And you should notice that this function depends on the distribution from which the values are drawn. So the absolute best case scenario you could hope for is this general compiler that takes as input the distributional assumptions and hands you back in a silver platter the optimal thing to do. And then the icing on the cake would be if this optimal thing to do was simple to describe and implement, exactly as here. So you do this transformation indicated by the virtual value functions, pick the highest, and you're done. Now, you don't have to remember this formula, but the point is that there is a simple closed form formula. That's why we all love Myerson's solution in the IPV setting. The big question in this paper then is, can we get a solution that we love equally as much for a well-motivated setting outside of IPV? And why outside of IPV? Well, a lot of problems are not most naturally modeled as IPV. Let's circle back to the two applications we talked about. First of all, in the plot of land, obviously, you as a bidder don't have enough information. You don't know if the land has oil or if it doesn't. Also, you don't have the independence assumption as well. Clearly, you'd like it more if it has oil, and other people will also like it more in the same way if it has oil. Same thing with the painting. Maybe it's a fake painting, maybe it's authentic. Same two assumptions of independence and private values are violated in this case. So, what are the problems that we see? First of all, we have correlation between the bidders' values. And secondly, the bidders don't even know their values because these are dependent on information that they do not possess. Another great indication of that scenario is the case where a bidder can resell the item that they got from a seller. And this is because in this case, they don't only have their supposedly private value for the item, but since they can resell it in the future, their value at the current moment also depends on what the values of others is likely to be in the future. So we're going to talk about a new model where we're going to have new phenomena. And a key feature of this new model is that we're going to have adverse selection as a risk for the seller. That is, the item might be more valuable than the seller thinks it is. In a high level, in the model, we're going to have two entities. First of all, the market maker that you should imagine as a seller, but is willing to buy or sell quantities of an asset. And then we're going to have the traders, which you should imagine as buyers that are going to have some bounded, without loss of generality, unit demand, who either want to buy one unit or sell one unit of the asset. And so we're going to focus on the effect of the seller having non-independent private value. In particular, their value depends on what the buyers do. As the buyers come along, the seller, in an ex post fashion, updates the valuation of the asset. So that is conditional on some buyer actually buying the item. The seller's value should have been higher than it actually was. The inspiration for this model comes from the market microstructure literature, which is basically about goods that correspond to shares of a stock. We'll talk about a generalization of Myerson's virtual values that is still tractable enough to yield closed form results. Let's go into a little bit more detail about the model. Each buyer comes individually to the mechanism with a valuation V that comes from some distribution F. That is the marginal distribution of a marginal buyer. And the buyer gives value V hat to the mechanism, and for that gets an asset allocation X of V hat and pays some payment Y of V hat. The buyer's utility is going to be the standard one that we all know. So they're going to value this asset that they got at their actual valuation, and they're going to also have their utility reduced by the amount of payment that they make. The mechanism is going to be bidder dominant strategy incentive compatible if and only if for any valuation of the bidder and any other possible value that they could tell to the mechanism, it is weakly optimal for them to actually declare their true value to the mechanism compared to any other value to the mechanism. And so the seller will also have a private valuation V0. And after the seller sees a trader's report, the value V, they're going to, in an ex post fashion, update their valuation according to some arbitrary rule, pi. Pi could basically be anything you could imagine. And so this update rule, pi, depends on the prior valuation of the seller and the value that they got from the bidder. The seller is going to be assessed according to an objective that corresponds to the ex post profit that they make. That is, they're happy that they received some payment. Why? But they also lost some asset, and the asset that they gave away is going to be assessed at the ex post updated valuation that they would have had they seen the value in advance. And so the key feature of this model is that this objective is a non-IPV seller, basically. It depends on the ex post valuation of the seller. So back in the IPV model, why did we say we like Myerson's solution so much? That is because it's this compiler that took distributional assumptions and told us exactly what to do in a way that was very interpretable and easy to compute. On this slide, while the formulas are slightly more complicated, we get an equally nice solution for this non-IPV problem. There's a notion of two types of virtual values that are going to give a threshold above which to buy or sell, and it's going to be optimal. And so in particular, we extract a condition that says that the expected profit that the seller gets from this model is basically going to have two components. One for when the value obtained by the bidder is larger than the prior valuation of the seller. That's going to correspond to some upper virtual value function, effectively saying that this is corresponding to an expected virtual welfare. And if, on the other hand, the value declared by the bidder is lower than the prior valuation of the seller, then we're going to have a different virtual value function that's going to be a lower virtual value function. So these virtual value functions, they should remind you of the ones that we saw by Myerson, except that the update rule, the ex post update rule, is also in there. And so the optimal solution will have basically two valuations, V1 and V2, that are going to be roots of the upper and lower virtual value functions correspondingly, such that the seller will sell the item if and only if the valuation of the bidder is larger than the first root of the upper virtual value function, and they're going to buy the item if the valuation is lower than the root of the lower virtual value function. In between these two roots, the seller is not going to be willing to neither buy nor sell the item. So what did we see? We saw that the single parameter auctions, they're well solved in the IPV setting, but the IPV setting is inappropriate for applications that have a strong common value component. Our contribution is to give a model for a non-IPV seller along with a complete solution that leads to a Myersonian-like characterization to the revenue maximizing mechanism. The open question that remains is the following. While you wouldn't expect something as clean as Meyerson for arbitrary non-IPv settings, what are the limits that you can push such a nice characterization as this? Oh, and by the way, this painting that you saw earlier, $69.3 million.